It's a beautiful late autumn day in Finland. We had our first frosts last night, a couple of degrees below freezing. It's about 3 or 4 degrees now, but absolutely fantastic day. There's a northerly wind, which always means that we don't get the trails in the sky from the aeroplanes. The colours are just fantastic. But I've not come to talk about that or this. The first thing is to talk about programming, because I think we've all got to accept the fact that we've been programmed by the system over our lifetimes. So a lot of that programming went on at school, and what I've noticed is that in particular most people's underlying paradigm, the way that they sort of see the world, is through a Marxist lens. And one of the things that they don't get at all is the issue of exploitation. So what you've been programmed to think is that a business, private business, is inherently exploitative, and therefore it's a bad thing. So employers exploit their employees, you know, so nurses are exploited, cleaners are exploited, because they all should be getting paid a higher wage. So other kind of lines that you'll hear, program lines, are stuff like, oh, Apple exploits its customers by charging rip-off prices for its products. Or fashion companies use advertising which exploits people by forcing them to buy their clothes. You know, you'll hear lines like that, or at least I used to do with many of the teachers that I used to work with. So the programming ends with ideas like, you know, profit is a bad thing, profit equals exploitation, private businesses, you shouldn't trust them, you should be wary of them because they're out to exploit you. Schools also program people into accepting the belief that unlike private businesses, you should always trust the government, because they never try to exploit anybody. You see, because the thing is that governments don't make profit. That's the big killer argument that they tell young people. So no profit means no exploitation. That's the association. Private business makes profit, therefore it's exploitative. The government provides services, they don't make a profit, therefore you can always trust them, and they're non-exploitative, and they're your friend. So this is total brainwashing. So I think the thing to understand is that people are exploited when they're coerced into doing something that they otherwise wouldn't have done. In other words, exploited people don't have a choice. Newsflash, governments don't have their own money. They get their money from you via taxes. So do you think that you get value for money from your taxes? Do you think you get good quality public services in return for what you pay? Or, using a word that you were taught at school, does the government exploit you? And this is what it all boils down to, is fundamentally is a lack of choice, a lack of agency. If you don't pay your taxes, the government will send somebody around called the police or a bailiff, or you'll be summoned to court, and ultimately you'll be fined and put in prison if you don't comply with the government's request to hand over part of your income that you've earned helping other people and pay your taxes. So for me, I call that exploitation, because, as I say one more time, you have no choice. You have to do what the government tells you to do. There's no voluntary aspect to this. This is coerced exchange. On the other hand, if you look at the private sector, you know, people say, oh, I'm being exploited by, I don't know, the Glazers. I'm a Man United fan and they're charging rip-off season tickets. Well, my answer to that is that you're choosing of your own free will to buy those season tickets. It's not like the Glazers are going to come round your house like the government ultimately would do and threaten you to put you in prison unless you paid up. So there's a big difference. So your Marxist program is now probably urging you to shout out, yeah, Watson, but, you know, what about monopolies? You know, privately owned businesses where there's a sole supplier to a market and that monopolist can charge whatever they want. Isn't that exploitative? And my response to that would be, yeah, kind of. It can be, but it depends. So are there any substitutes for the product? Is it regarded as being essential? But the thing is, you see, is that even if there are a few substitutes people think it's essential, the monopoly might not last, because if they're charging high prices, what that'll encourage is a new entrant into the market who's attracted by the massive exploitative profits that are on offer, and there's obviously a gap in the market for a substitute at a lower price. So basically, monopolies in the private sector, if they're privately owned, they won't be able to exploit their consumers for very long before a new entrant comes into the market. And basically what they're doing is trying to make profit by trying to help consumers escape the exploitation. So exploitation, if it happens, it won't last very long in the private sector. Now think about the government. Is there any safeguard like that? Are the new entrants in government? There's been a by-election today in somewhere in England, and Labour overturned a big Conservative majority in a particular seat. But the issue is that what we've realised now is that the uni party, you know, for want of a better word, Labour and Conservative, Greens, Liberal Democrats, whatever they're called this week, they're all part of the same club. And these people are the ones who are really responsible for the exploitation. Some people will say, well, yeah, what about the electricity and gas companies? You know, they're acting like monopolies, and there doesn't seem to be any new entrants. So therefore, the private sector does exploit us. And what I'd say to that is that it's the government that creates barriers to entry that stop new entrants coming into markets. So that's especially the case with banking and, say, the markets for electricity and gas. I don't know if you remember, some of you might remember this Bank of Dave Fishwick from Burnley, and it ended up being a TV series about him trying to establish a new bank, and it was next to impossible. And the reason why it was next to impossible was all the government regulations that stopped a potential new entrant into the banking market. So you might think, well, why do they do that? Well, basically, the government has these high regulatory hurdles so that they can protect their mates who they've granted monopolies to. Another kind of classic example of that would be, I remember Virgin Trains. So they had a monopoly over the supply of rail passenger transport between London and Manchester, and the train fares were ridiculous. So is that an example of private sector exploitation? Well, your Marxist programming that you got from school would say, yeah, it is. But I would say, no, it's not. The real exploitation that was going on there was a product of the government. The government granting a monopoly franchise to Richard Branson, and then forbidding other rail operators from competing on the same route. And that would have been possible, you know, if you think about Heathrow Airport, that's one common, you know, runway or whatever, and you've got maybe 150 airlines competing using that shared infrastructure, and planes can move, you know, up and down and side to side, you know, whereas a train only moves in one direction, backwards and forwards. It doesn't go up and down. So if a train, if aeroplanes can share the same runway, it should not be beyond the wit of mankind for trains to share the same track and stations. But that never happened because the government was in, or is still in bed with big corporations like Richard Branson, Virgin, the big energy companies, the big banks. In fact, what you would actually say is that those big corporations own the politicians. So that's the source of the exploitation, is the government protecting its mates, who then ensure that they remain in power, that the uni party stays in power and wins elections. So it's basically the government that's the source of your feelings, quite rightly so, of being exploited. So some conclusions then. The first one is that, yeah, exploitation does exist, but you've been programmed into thinking that it's the private sector that exploits you, that private businesses are a bad thing, you can't trust them, they're all exploitative. On the other hand, you've been programmed into thinking that mummy government is your saviour, it's going to protect you against these evil private businesses, and you should just trust them. They're your best mate and they're never going to exploit you. When the truth is, it's the exact opposite. It's the government that exploits you, not the private sector. Because all your dealings with government are compelled exchanges, you have to do what the government tells you to do, otherwise they fine you and put you in prison. As I said before, that is not the case with the private business. Oh yeah, somebody else might say, well, what about cartels? You know, groups of private businesses that get together and behave as though they were one big monopoly. Well, my response to that is that, again, it's governments that are protecting them, protecting the cartel by erecting these barriers to entry. The most common one is some forms of red tape that stop a potential new entrant coming into the market to undercut the firms who were already in the market, who are acting or as a cartel or practicing as a cartel. So the government isn't your best mate, and it's run by a bunch of crooks who force you into doing things. So I remember as a kid, my dad was a Manchester United fan, and when the Glazers, and I used to go along sometimes on my own, and as an adult, young adult. And anyway, when the Glazer family took over and they started trying to exploit the fan base, I just walked away and had enough of it. I have that choice. It's very difficult for people to walk away from Sadiq Khan and his ULEZ, or these climate taxes. You try walking away and they'll put you in jail. So there's a huge difference. I am allowed to walk away from Malcolm Glazer or the Glazer family, but I'm not allowed to walk away from Sadiq Khan or Rishi Sunak. Do you understand here? So the real exploiter is the government. So in the past, there used to be two ways of getting rich. The first way would be to set up a business that was either producing something that people wanted that currently wasn't available, or maybe by producing something that somebody else was currently selling but for a rip-off price, and you were going to undercut it. That first way of getting rich is quite difficult to achieve these days, because politicians make it very hard for new businesses to establish themselves unless they've got the right political connections. The other way of making wonga is to actually get involved in politics and become, in essence, a looter. You know, somebody who is joins the mafia crime families and extorts money out of people. And what I'm talking about here is taxation. And remember, one more time, you have no choice whatsoever about whether you pay your taxes or not. It's not a voluntary transaction like whether I choose to buy a new iPhone or renew a season ticket with Manchester United. And that's a huge difference. One type of exchange is voluntary, the other is compelled. Towards the end of my teaching career, I worked at quite a posh-ish public school in Surrey. And when I first started there, I was there for 15 years. So when I started, it was about 2006, I think it was. the girls at that time, some of them still had aspirations to make it in the private sector. However, by 2020, most of them, the really super ambitious ones, the ambition had never left them really. They were all quite material, or very materialistic people, and they wanted the trinket, so they needed the Captain Cash. So basically what they were now thinking was, well, the best way to get cash is to actually go up the hierarchy in the political system. And I must admit, at the time I definitely noticed it, and obviously I was a bit despondent about it, but it was a bellwether, a sign of the times. So again, people will be saying, well, yeah, but what's your solution? My solution is that we've got to massively scale back the size and the scope of the government if we're going to escape this kind of chronic exploitation problem that we've got. So many of the things that the government currently provides will have to be provided by the private sector in the future. So things like education and healthcare, they're way too important to be trusted with politicians to provide. There'll be some people here will say, well, what about quality? You know, like private companies, they might be inclined to like skip on quality. And to that, I would just say, like, have you been awake for the last 3 years? Maybe it's time for more of us to do our own research. Before you buy something, you research it, you try it out, you listen to what other people say who've bought similar products. The other thing that would have to change as well with a more private system would be getting rid of these barriers to entry, government created obstacles that stop new competitors from coming into a market. And what we've also got to do is kind of change our own mindset, that there's nothing, indeed, actually, you know, profit is a good thing. Profit is a sign and a signal that you've been doing things right, because people of their own free will have voluntarily chosen to buy your product. You know, profit is also a product of prices that consumers consider to be good value for money. Because if you're charging too much, somebody else will come in. And often the best way of making profit is to charge lower prices. Think about Lidl and Aldi and what they've done to the likes of Sainsbury and Waitrose and all of these other shops. Right, so final words, exploitation goes hand in hand with coercion, no choice, compelled exchange. That is ultimately what is exploitative. Exploitation is not voluntary free choice. So I'm sure that I'll get some comments about inequality, because I think that's another area where you've probably been programmed when you were at school. And what I'll do, depending on how well whether you like this video, I might do another explanation of what you've been taught about the subject of inequality and where the Marxist programming is, and what the alternative is, the more sensible approach to the issue of inequality. So anyway, Hyvää viikonloppua. It's Friday today, perjantai, and it's lovely. I've really enjoyed being out, and God bless you all.